My name is Robert. I run this gallery with my partner Anthea and the help of Catherine and Francesca, who works in the office. This exhibition is part of our annual programme funded by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. We do 6 exhibitions a year that last a month long. And so I asked Trish to do this exhibition for her own reasons, but also to fit in with the Linen Biennale, which we're running this year. But some people might know that. Head's not in or whatever. So yeah, so this is Arts Council funded, but part of the Linen Biennale as well. And the wonderful Trish Belford is here.
Thanks very much, Robert, and thank you for coming. Yeah, amazing. Just so many people, but it's probably because it's such a shitty day, I just thought we might as well come on. But a real thank you to Robert and our space and Anthea and Maeve and Francesca, who aren't here, but it's been a really great team this year.
Yeah.
And you know, hopefully it can all go on for 2 years' time.
Yeah, we're supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund to do the Biennale, so we've got to thank them and the lottery players. If you don't play the lottery, if you don't play the lottery, we don't get to do it.
So this is it's a sort of an exhibition of 2 halves. There's a link from the archives of Belford Prints, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then the most recent work, which was done over the last 2 years at the University of Ulster through another grant. And so the earlier part of it is based on the archives of Belford Prints, and I didn't really have a clue what I was going to do or what I was ending up doing, but I always was interested in art and chemistry at school and never really fitted in anywhere properly. So after doing a diploma in textiles, but I was always in the print room, I was much more print and process led, although you don't really question those things, you just do what you like doing. So in 1986, I ended up underneath the arches in London, screen printing, and we started screen, well, it was just me on my own in the early days, so we did everything from mixing the colour, getting the customers, screen printing and delivering it. And this is pre-digital, so this is quite important as part of the basis of the talk, that there was no digital printing. So everything was done through silk screens. And for anybody that knows about silk screen printing, you need a different screen for a different colour. And whereas we're spoilt with digital now, you can sort of scan anything in and print it back. But I wasn't really thinking about it along those terms and formed very good relationships with a lot of very well-known designers. But we were all younger then, a lot younger. And so the way it started off was, I'd be given a design on paper, and then I would have to think through expertise of separation artists, colour, printing, how I could reduce maybe a 10-colour design down to 2 or 3 colours, or how many screens they were prepared to pay for. And I mean, in those days, the screen was £350. So, and fashion was moving very cyclical, every season. So they didn't want to have to do lots and lots of different screens for different, for different prints, because they had to be economical. So through that, and I never really understood how important that whole thing was. So through, having to do a couple of screens and print them, we ended up with sort of lots of beautiful overlaps and little things that weren't quite perfect. And and the designers were amazing. I mean, there was Vivienne Westwood, Nisha Crossland, Jasper Conran, Georgina Vanetstoff, to name a few, and they would give me a design, and this is probably quite a good example. That was a Vivienne Westwood shirt, Dragon's design, and it was actually only 2 screens, but in order to make it look like more, we blended colour through it, and we got all the little incidental overlaps that were done via screen. And that was done in 1994. And then interestingly, when their volumes went bigger, they had to go to China, and that was fine. We all talked to each other and we dealt with it. There was no way I was going to compete with China, but we did all these specialised things. But the great thing about that was, when it went to China for volume on cotton, she kept all the little innuendos of the overlaps and the slightly uneven overlaps, because she was an amazing person. She could see the value of process and not looking completely perfect. And so once earlier on, before that actually, which is how I got into working with Vivienne Westwood, I got a phone call from her husband Andreas in Italy. He'd been asking for a particular process discharge out of indigo, really chemically and from a chemistry textile point of view, an incredibly difficult process to do. Because if any of you ever tried to bleach indigo, it's a very strong bond and it's very, very difficult to do. The Italians obviously didn't want to do it, or because I'm sure they had the capabilities. And Andrea said, well, I know somebody under the arches that can do it. So he contacted me, and this was Marlene Dietrich with a massive photograph and wanted it discharged in denim. And I said, well, I didn't actually say I didn't know how to do it. I just said, well, yeah, I'll work it out. I hadn't a clue. And we did work it out. Now, you'd never get that now, because they wouldn't do this process probably, and you couldn't repeat that digitally because you wouldn't get that solid background. The only way you get something like that now would be probably through heavy, thick pigment. But I did ask him, please do not do volume in this. Could we just have it for the catwalk? Because 25 metres of wet denim, if anybody's ever tried handling it, so difficult. Anyway, sod's law, as things happen, it's sort of a tipping point. Marlene Dietrich died when the catwalk was on, so the sales went through the roof, and we had to do it because fashion designers didn't really listen to you. They just sold. If they sold it, you had to deliver it. So it was very fraught through each season. You're working for all the same people. It's all different people, but ending up at the same point, which is London Fashion Week or Paris Fashion Week. So you've got to get your samples on time, you've got to get your delivery on time, and then you've got to do your production. So I actually don't know how any of us sort of, I don't know how we did not go nuts really. Because it was very fraught, really fraught, and you know, anything could go wrong, as it invariably did. But that was a real sort of pivotal point in, you know, working and understanding how to do discharge. Jasper Conrad had wanted a similar thing, but he had to make it all slightly different, and he was actually fantastic to work for. Very, like, we rolled up firebomb, you know, he had a real temper, but actually, in fact, I really liked him because he was prepared to work with you. You know, sometimes people would say they want something and you can't do it, and they don't accept that. So I did the same process for him, but this was the right way around, which he didn't like. In fact, he sort of was very rude about it, but then he saw the back and loved the back, so we ended up doing this print as a front, you know, as a front to back one, which is difficult because A, when you're printing discharge you can't see, and B, you're printing the front to try and get the back, and then again everything had to be delivered and on time, as I said earlier. This board here is probably the most pivotal in terms of understanding what I could then try to offer customers who didn't know how to ask for things. And that's not out of ignorance, it's just everybody has their own skill set, and I have always worked with other people. You know, everything I've ever done, right through from here, working with customers, through to the university, it's never been a lone process. And this was Redoute Rose for Vivienne Westwood, and she was a past master at taking other things and doing something with it. So, you know, this concept of having everything to be original is terribly difficult. It's what you do with it that makes it original. And this was pre-digital again, so in order to replicate the rose, we had to do, for anybody that knows about screen printing on paper, the cyan, the magenta, the black, and the yellow, the little dotty screens. And subsequently, we ended up with a sort of slightly weird colour combination, but again, she loved that. Now, if this was to be done digitally now, it would look perfect. It wouldn't have this look of sort of slight oddness. Now, we didn't know that we were going to end up with it looking like this when we started, but again, she was amazing. If she liked it, you worked with it, and you sort of went along in that way. And she had a lot of jeans that they didn't really know what to do with, so she kind of gave them all to me, And so I took the black screen, which is a blotch, so we printed that solid black. Now if that was to be done digitally now, you'd have to digitally print that black and it would never, I don't think, look as black. So I took the black screen and then printed with a gold metallic on the jeans and then sprayed here a discharge. So I was sort of playing, and playing was really important for me, probably still is, and would give her back something that she didn't know to ask for. So that was a really key part, and that's how I ended up working with all the best of my customers. I would go off, and my little brother worked for me, and he'd say, God, Patricia's been in the print room on Saturday, God knows what's coming back to us in a couple of months' time. And then I would take a box once or twice a week and go down to London, because by this time we'd moved under the Arches and we were up in Macclesfield, and probably employing 10 or 20 people at that point, and take them all, loads and loads of samples, and I had lots of different ideas that I showed different customers. That's 95, 96, they're all sitting about in boxes. And then what they were really good at, particularly actually Georgina Vanetslov and Nisha Crosland, they were really good at looking at, just scruffy little bits of fabric. They didn't care that they were mounted. Lots of little techniques. I did everything often using a dot, on different fabrics. And the dot actually was a really good vehicle to understand the process, because there was no design interference. And working with Nisha, she would look at all the different designs and ideas and techniques, and then she would flip it. She would come up with the design after I showed her the process. And one of them is that scarf up there, which again was using a dot, and we shrank it and put a little, and that went into Liberties for about 550 in, I think that's end of the 1990s, and they all sold within the first couple of days because it was so different and it was so unique. So she's also taken the dot again here in this design Morello, but then in order for us to move it on a little bit, we sort of devored a little hexagonal line across it, because each season we had to move things along. We couldn't just do that. We were lucky with the Devore that we had it for such a long period of time. Jasper Conran, actually, darling Jasper, was the first person to ask me to do it, and it took me a week to do 5 metres after I'd wrecked about 200 metres. He did it, and Naomi Campbell, there's a photograph in here somewhere. Naomi Campbell modelled it. Now he never really sold. Naomi Campbell modelled this dress. Now that took me probably a week and 200 metres of fabric to get that right. But then you get it right. You have to go through sort of lots of obstacles, and you get it right, and then it just grew and developed, and it was English eccentrics that probably really made their claim for the Devore. So I thought, I found this in my old wardrobe. I've worn it for about 30 years, but this was their first Devore, and they sold hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of metres of it. And Devore is actually nothing new. It was developed in the 17th century, and it was like a cheap alternative to the French for lace. And Devore comes from the French verb to devour, and that's where it originated from. When I get to the boards, I will explain a wee bit more about the actual process, but this first part is just going through the Belford Prints archives and how we ended up getting to where I have ended up being now. And so this was dead simple, just one colour, just dyed. So they had to move it on and on and on every season until it got more and more complicated. And then you weren't being cost effective. So you had to find a new process. And a process that followed on from the Devore within Belford was flocking. But flocking has been about everywhere, because it's on, generally you see it in Indian restaurants and wallpaper. This was for Designers Guild, but what was particularly difficult and stupid about this one is this is very long pile flock, with a short pile flock in another colour. And can you imagine the contamination of that? But we did it, and we ended up doing hundreds of metres for Designers Guild with this design. And that was very important because it was a move into furnishing fabrics, because fashion was so fraught with precariousness that we needed to get into furnishing, because it was a bit more of a slower printing model. And you know, once you did that, it would be in stock and you could keep replacing it, you could keep doing it the following year. And most fashion designers that you see now, a lot of them have moved into furnishing, and it's for that sort of safety aspect reason. I mean, and when I talk about the mistakes are so important, you know, and that's why when I taught students, you have to record everything. Because this was a linen wool for John England, and they wanted a Devore print on it. So I printed a Devore recipe, and it came out like that, and I thought I'd done it wrong. So I repeated it 5 times, and it still came out like that. And it was obviously something to do with the twist and the weave of the fabric that generated this, but we would never have known how to start to create that through print. So that's why it was very important to catalogue and document everything that was done. And they sold an awful lot of this. It used to terrify me, because I thought, if they change anything in that, if they change anything in that twist, then I'm buggered, because I've got 500 metres of fabric that hasn't worked. And you know, invariably that did sort of happen. So yeah, I'm still in contact with a lot of the people, because we just did what we had to do, run a business. But my sort of, I suppose, midlife crisis started in 2004, or because I was textile crisis. And digital came in 1999, and it was phenomenal, and I don't knock digital. Digital is a fantastic method of printing, because it's instant, you don't need hundreds of screens, you can do small runs, so it completely opened it up to a lot of fashion designers that wanted print. And so you can see this explosion of print through digital, but I felt completely out of touch with the customer, the client, and the process. I was in charge of just a big photocopier. And when before they accepted my translation from paper through to cloth like that, or you know, some of these, you know, like this, they got something back that was invariably more interesting than the paper design. It was less flat. With digital, they wanted the perfect. They wanted it to come back looking exactly like what they had given the printer. And they also, because there was a lot of new, young, up-and-coming fashion designers, they were also a bit of a pain in the arse as well. Because they didn't want to understand the process, they didn't care. If I would say, no, that's not really going to be working out, they really didn't care. So when I told somebody to F off at one point, I thought, this is actually the time for me to just, you know, get. I leave the digital printing in the business to other, you know, the rest of the business to run, because it just wasn't for me. It was like just running a big photocopier. Having said that, Georgina, because she had an incredible sense of colour and design, did do digital well. I think this was one of the earlier digital ones that she did. So she's really used digital printing, you know, to blend it, to shade it, and then to make it more interesting, we printed it on the back of velvet, so it sort of gave it that kind of a look. So she brought her painterly skills into it. So she was a painter, that was a textile designer, but in order for her to cope with digital printing, because she didn't like it either, you know, just because she felt it took the soul away from the product, she went back to painting. And you know, so her digital is back to her being a painter, so at least she's able to use it for its advantages. And often when you're speaking to students and they say, well, I want to do digital printing, you go, well, but that's not how you do it. You look at what you've got to print, and then that determines whether it goes to digital. Most things now are done digitally, and very, very well, so I'm not knocking it. So when I came back here, I didn't really know what I was going to do, and I was very lucky, to get a job at the Ulster University doing research. And it was during that time that I really gathered up an interest in archives and what you could do with archives. And it's all about, I thought the only way I can survive keeping doing textiles is how do I change things all the time. A bit like, how do I use chemistry or alchemy to change the basis of that fabric and give back and work on something that you can't just generate on its own. So I also decided that I really needed to learn how to write funding grants, because with that you can get a certain autonomy and you can also get research assistants to help you work. But it was always about stuff that I felt was really valuable and I wanted to do. It wasn't just a box ticking exercise. So this was a lovely project called The Beauty of Experiment. And in this one, this was done with, and I love to work with different people from different disciplines. So Dr. Philip Sykas is the most amazing historian in Manchester, and he wasn't really interested in print processes, but he was interested in revealing the history about a particular process that Turnbull and Stockdale, who are printers in Manchester, and they did this particular process called shadow printing, which is where you have the warp and then you print on it and then you put the weft in afterwards. And I've made that sound very, very simple. It's actually incredibly complicated. So Philip did all the research, which is this part. Very detailed research. He's so fastidious and so just such a brilliant person to work with. And he fed that back to myself and Beth Milligan, who is a weaver, excellent weaver, worked on this project for 2 years. So we just took one process, which was the warp printing, and took it through lots and lots and lots and lots of different stages. And that's what this book is about. And that's in fact our final piece of fabric was this. And so that, we never had a vision of how we were going to end up, but we got there through doing lots and lots and lots of experimentation. So in actual fact, that was the warp print, that hexagonal thing, and then this is what it ended up like. So it was a complete transformation through one process. So this is all about one process going through lots and lots of different permutations, and there's only a few. We did one copy that had the samples in it. And you know, Minnie McAleish, who was a 1920s designer, you know, she has some really, you know, there's a whole vast world of knowledge wrapped up in a piece of pattern cloth. And I think that's so relevant to working within print or within weave or any form of textiles. You know, there's everything that goes behind it, the knowledge that goes behind it that we don't often see. But unless you have that knowledge, you don't get what you're looking at, if that makes sense. And you know, her view really resonated with me, that we're so made that doing nothing but using brain and hand together enables us to grasp facts. I have to use the hand through making with my head. I can't sort of do the two things separately. But that's just the way I work, and I work through experimentation and messing about, really. It's a good technical term. And after that one, there was 1,600 photographic glass plates that were willed to the University of Ulster, and they were probably going to go into a skip at some point. So Barbara Das, and what is so ironic, I was doing this talk to Amanda Croft's group last week, had this book up like this, and who should walk in the door but Barbara Das? She was a fantastic weaver at the university, and we worked together in this. And then, again, Barbara's methodical way of working and my slightly sort of, you know, well, let's try this and let's try that way of work together. So we got these all digitised, rescued, saved, and the originals are actually down in the Lisbon Museum. And I'm really keen that these things don't stay behind the box and anybody can use them. So I was delighted to get an email a couple of weeks ago from Born Textiles to say that they want to use the glass plates as an origination for something, you know, that they're going to do, which is how Barbara and I envisaged that work being done.
Would you tell me more about the glass plates? Because I used to print all the glass plates in the Ulster Museum, taken by the Hogg collection.
These glass plates are actually, we had no idea. They're photographic
Yes.
record
Yes.
of all the designs that William Little did.
Oh, right.
I'm sort of just touching on this loosely, but it's a good question because I don't want to go into too much depth in what we did here, because this is just, I suppose, to do with the interest in archives, but these were photographic. It was a record of the work that the company William Little did, and they're now held down in the museum. And then we took 6 of them and again did something new. So it's just really like that's how it worked. Taking something, I mean, in fact, when we got the grant, all I wanted to do was just fire off and make, just play around and do new textiles from the glass plates. But we did have to go through, and it was worth doing it, we had to go through the whole cataloguing of everything and how, the history. We ran road shows, we did all sorts of things, which I would have just loved to have jumped to the end bit and just done the fun bit, but we had to go through all of that. That was funded by Heritage Lottery Fund, you have to say, were amazing. And that is why I bought a lottery ticket every week since then. Because they knew they were fantastic, totally on board. I think you probably find the same, Robert.
Yeah.
They're really, really great. They'll talk to you and they want to support things, they don't want things to fail. So they were fantastic. But the record of that is down in the museum. And so in 1998, I was sitting at New Designers, feeling a bit frustrated. It was really hot, thinking, well, what next? And then I just thought, Georgina and Nisha had been in contact with me, and they kept saying, they still referred to all their boxes of samples, and I thought, well, do you know what, maybe there is one archive that hasn't been looked at, because we didn't realise at the time that what we were doing had any specialness. As I said, we just did what we did. So I wrote another Leverhulme grant, and the Leverhulme were really, really good at funding things that are practical. And it was about going back through all the old, so I went to see Vivienne Westwood, who were fabulous. I arrived at this is at the end of 1999? No, that's not right. 2019, yeah. Just before the dreaded 2020. And because I needed to do a feasibility study, because you need to put about 6-7 months into writing these grants if you're going to get them. So I wanted to do a feasibility study, so I'd been to these companies, they are keen. They couldn't have been more amazing, because all the fabrics were laid out, all the press books were laid out, everything that I'd ever done for them, and it was just there for me. And Maria came with me, and she had a ball. I mean, Maria took a couple of these photographs. This was one of the colleagues that. So, they were so helpful, because they actually did say, do you know what, we were all in that little, for 10 years, that little pocket of just screen printing and doing stuff that we didn't know at the time that was important. So they were hugely supportive. Nisha Crossan was the same. She just gave me free rein in her studio so I sort of resorted to, cutting out bits of paper and sticking them in the book and working out what year they came from. And the same with Nisha. Then, Anna Duffy, who was a fabulous research assistant and an ex-student, she was employed to come onto the project and start in March 2020. So, well, we all know what happened in March 2020. So we all got delayed, but Anna and we kept working through back at home, backwards and forwards, but we had to rethink about how we would show the work. Our original intention would have been that we'd have gone to London and GV and Nisha Crossan a lot more and picked out things. So in actual fact, in a way, it probably sort of helped us, because we had to completely redefine. I mean, I spent a month in my back garden getting starch out of potatoes, because I thought, there's Japanese starch processes, what can I do at home? So I grated hundreds of different types of Irish potatoes that I could get a hold of. And bizarrely enough, a rooster Irish potato gives a much better resist than Japanese rice starch. So that was just one way we started to work. And then we were able to get back into university. We sort of thought, I looked back at this, which was one process, and Anna and I thought, well, perhaps if we take 6 processes that reflect some of the work that happened in Belford. And Nisha Crossan designed a design for us which is botanical, and then Georgina gave us one of her old designs. It's about 30 years old, Miss May's. So we took those two designs and then took them through 6 processes, but we had to add in a couple of different processes, you know, just to sort of make it slightly more contemporary. So booklets, the 10 booklets are the overview, pivotal prints. There's one dedicated to Nisha Crossan and how she worked and her designs and how her design thinking is. There's one for Georgina, and again about the history of them and how they worked. And then the other 6 booklets relate to the 6 processes. Because I worked with a fantastic graphic designer, Paul Kelly, who this time last year, when we were nearly completing, was going into his office to finish off all this work. And he was unfortunately one of the designers in the cathedral buildings, so he lost everything. Oh. And we also had a lot of photographs and stuff. Fortunately, I hadn't left a lot of stuff there. All the shuttles and shafts books, but so I had to. It was just, well, it was horrendous for everybody. But I just gave him space for 6 months. I just thought, do you know what? We'll just leave it. And then he's come back and he's produced these. I mean, it was the wire. They arrived 2 days before the exhibition, and I was in Spain proofreading on my phone stuff that I'd written 2 years ago. And then Paul and I go, Jesus, we can't even remember what we did. But anyway, he's done an amazing job. So there's a poster that relates to each board, which has got a very simple summary on it. That one I've already explained, which is about the devore. Then, which is there, and devore is a process where you have 2 fabrics that are sandwiched. One is cellulose and one is protein generally, and you have a recipe that eats away at one and preserves the other. And then when I said about having to move on from this, which is just plain navy, we had to go into cross dye. For many of the customers, that's cross dye, yeah, which is where you drive one dye onto the silk or the protein fibre and another dye onto the viscose or the cellulose fibre, and they separate out and then hit one another. Now, that was brilliant to do because we didn't really mind what the colours were as long as we liked it. But when I was doing thousands and thousands of metres for clients, they had to have the right colour back. So you'd have a vat with 500 metres in it and just think, you know, so we had to work to really precise, absolutely precise chemistry and timing, pH values and everything. So on the left there is the Miss May's design, and then on the right is the botanical. And I get real bored really, really quickly. So on the botanical, I started to take other screens and print gold in the background, which actually is relative to this scarf, which is a devore that we did for Nisha Crossan. What date's on that, Robert?
2000?
Yeah, 2000. And then we printed little gold shagreen, one of her other screens in the background. And then Georgina, each customers have had their own identity. English eccentrics were very much the devore, and they sold hundreds of metres of it. Georgina was velvet. That was her. You know, there was this great phrase Georgina Vanetstoff did for velvet what Bic did for the barrow. Now, and the viscose velvet, which is this pile, is beautiful, and the colours come up. Things have changed. We couldn't get this any longer, so we had to revert to a cotton velvet, which is a lot more dull, but again, by turning the screens around and flipping them backwards and forwards, we got some interesting results. And there are so few dyes that now work. And discharge is a process where the base is dyed with a dye that actually breaks down when you've got a print colour and there's a chemical in there that illuminates. So when you print the print colour on it, if the two things are working correctly, the dye will break and the print colour will illuminate and come out. You could have 2 identical pieces of navy velvet, and one could work and one couldn't, and that is because it's down to the way the first bit is dyed. So it's back to the root basis of what do you do with your fabric and how you treat it. So, you know, with digital you can sort of just whack anything onto anything, and the fibre does not matter, but with that process, It's everything. It's the fibre, the dye, the print. And again, with discharge printing, I'm sure a lot of you know, when you print it, you can't see it. So we're printing 25 metres at a time, and then it's only when it comes out of the steamer that you know whether you've got a bit of a catastrophe or if it's okay. This was the very first discharge print I did for Georgina. And again, it's got all those hallmark things of a little halo round it now. In Italy, where they were doing probably really perfect discharge printing, the halo would be viewed as a mistake or an error. But we quite liked it. So part of the recipe has got urea in it, and urea attracts moisture, so it flushes the paste out. So we sort of would up the content of the urea. I mean, I wouldn't do this now because it's far too precarious when you think you've got to deliver all this. So we'd up the content of the urea so that the design would flush. And I was so excited when I took that out of the steamer. Georgina didn't know about discharge printing. They'd given me that set of screens to print colour on white, that's what they wanted because that's what they knew. And then I jumped in the car and drove to Salisbury. And hence, they became really, really well known for discharge and velvet, and a lot of the Liberty scarf halls were full of their kind of, their stuff. They were brilliant. They're still going in a much smaller way. So pigment is the most basic form of printing. As I mentioned earlier, you just have the fabric and you just whack print on it. You get what you see, you print the colour through a screen and you get what you see, and it's much more stable. But I was sort of thinking, well, what can we do with pigment that will sort of give it another, give it something else that can't happen on its own. And that's when I've been doing quite a lot of work with William Clark in Upperlands. And actually, after I left Ulster, I did a lovely 10-month project with William Clark, funded by the University of Arts London, looking at Irish linen. So Duncan and I, beetling had only ever been done by them on plain linen, which and it was done for to reinforce tailor, suiting for tailors. So we started experimenting with lots and lots of linen pigment printing. And what I loved about this was on one of these, like this one, if you look closely at it, we printed pigment and then we turned the screen around. But with the beetling, and beetling is bashing with big hammers linen for 140 hours constantly, and it gives it this gorgeous sort of like waxed surface. But also what we discovered was when it was beetled, the underprint sort of came to the surface. So that didn't look like that before we beetled it. So for me, I think that's just amazing. You've got something by their process. So two things are equal. It's just not, it's like a proper process of collaboration. So and again, that's botanical. We didn't think worked terribly well. The scale of how different designs work. It was too much solid colour, but the Mismaze ones, particularly when you look at the side, got a lovely secondary effect that we didn't expect at all. So that's. So William Clark were the only commercial beetling people left in the world, and they've done fabrics for Alexander McQueen, and so I think it's a beautiful process in linen. The one other process that we never really did at Belford Prints was natural dyes, although I did get asked by Linda McCartney. I mean, I'm not a name dropper, I'll just tell you. She wanted to do a whole range. We tried it, but within the commercial vehicle of trying to get things on time, get the cost effective. And the thing is with actual natural dyes, they're not very fast, or they certainly weren't then. And I've people that are really good at natural dyeing and printing properly, I've got a huge amount of respect for, because it's so labour intensive. Now Anna did a lot of this work, and she's a brilliant researcher, well anyway, she is a very good researcher, and she's very methodical, but I, did lay down ground rules that everything has to be recorded. So these are all the samples that we did for all the cross dyeing, so that we have a record of them. But she loved this aspect of it, she loved that whole aspect of, testing, and more testing. So these are all her sheets that were, some were treated with vinegar before, or an acid. We'd some treated with bicarbonate of soda, which is an alkali. And we just worked through using 6 different types of natural dyes. And what was brilliant about working with Anna was I would set her off with suggestions. She'd go off and do it, and invariably she'd come back with something else, and that really is a brilliant way of working with anybody. Or I would see something that she'd done and then, or worked on, and then maybe I'd suggest a different way of doing it, and she did. But the reason I've got these here is everything that goes into just one board. There's so much stuff that goes on behind it, which is often, and that's where the knowledge comes from. So Anna did a fabulous job on the natural dyes. Again, I don't think the designs work particularly well. I don't, but this is about process. The designs work on some things and they don't work on others. I think, for example, in Misma's, the beetling works really well, but on Botanical it works really well and other things. I just don't think either of those designs particularly lent themselves to the colour palette of the natural. Maybe 1 or 2 of the Misma's, but not everything works. But so that's probably, I struggle with that one from a design aesthetic point of view. But again, these are about processes. The other one that we had to do was obviously shrink, because Nisha Crossland was the big shrink person. As I said, different customers picked up different techniques. We did that one, which is just one colour, and then we had to move on and get different colours in here. So this was a scarf from 2001, which is one of my favourite, which is why people have seen me wearing. But we had to move it on from being one colour to putting an acid dye in there, an acid dye in here, printing a resist there, and you're just moving it on. And again, she was brilliant, because if the colour she would give me a vague palette, and then we'd have to work that palette into the process. So this is Misma's and Botanical on shrink. Again, Misma's is probably working better. This is a sheet, but we sort of quite liked it, because that's got the elastane in it, but it is shrinking. But then you see, I like the way you get that, which has matted it up, and it's got a lovely back. So those are just different aspects of the shrink. When I worked in shuttles and shafts, we got Beth to do some, Barbara's suggestion originally. We were having a conversation, and I was asking the question, as a printer and dyer, what if the warp, which is these threads, was dyed with a dischargeable dye, in other words, dye that's going to bleach, and the weft was dyed with another black dye, but that wasn't going to bleach. And in response to that, Barbara sort of said, well, what if there were weave structures that would partly be revealed by the discharge process, it's thus creating a new pattern within a pattern. Now, I'm not a weaver, so I don't know anything about structures. So Beth did a lovely piece based on this way of working. So I sort of felt, in order to show process and 2 different designs working differently, I got her to do another series. Again, we worked on it together. So these are the structures. Lucy, you're probably going to have to correct me here. These are the structures. This is like a computer.
Say whatever you want.
These are the structures. So she wove these different structures, different formations of warp and weft. When it was on its own as a fabric, they were really hard to see. They were subtle, but but you couldn't really see them. But when we came and then discharge printed over them, again, I like the simplicity of the fact that it's one screen. We get a completely different result. So this was actually all woven in one piece. So that's what's happening with that structure in the discharge. Here, obviously, the way the structures are woven and what's coming to the surface and what's going to the back. Yeah, you see not much happening in the back there. What's going to the surface and what's going to the back, and that structure is exposing a lot more of the bleach pattern. Whereas here, it's much more three-dimensional. And so that just sort of really important to bring that process back into looking at, you know, the same design and different processes. So Anna was, you know, she worked on the project for 2 years and then finished it. She finished it a year ago, and then we had big problems, you know, with the fire. So this is probably 2 years late. But you know, Paul can't be here today, but I really have to give him a huge thanks for putting this work together. And to Anna, who's, you know, was a great research assistant. She's now working at the university. And actually, I said to Anna, all this can go back as, you know, as a resource. If you can, there's boxes in it, boxes in it. So I'm saying to Anna, oh, you know, to take it back, because I'm a real believer that all the recipes are in these books, because it's a bit like baking a Michelin cake. Everybody will do it differently. So it's what you do with it that makes the change. So I've no protecting it, because nothing's original, and it's what, you know, these recipes have probably been out there for a long time. So all the recipes are in the book, and I wanted to formulate the notebooks or the booklets like a recipe book. That's how it started off. I think I was reading Salt, Acid, Fat, Heat at the time. I thought, wouldn't it be nice that we could have a recipe book, but not one that was so formulated that had, you know, nice photographs. So yeah, Anna, Paul, Robert, Stuart built the table. He just retired, he came down and built the table because I wanted a long table. And I think that's enough, isn't it?
Who would have thought textiles were so complicated?
I probably make it complicated. So if there's any questions, or just feel free to rummage and root.
Trish, I have a question. I just want to ask about that garment.
Oh, I would have put that on today if I hadn't been here. This is Georgina Manette stuff, and it's a bit like having to say we have to move all the processes on. So this print was like, actually I've got dining, so I've got my curtains in front of me.
I was going to say that.
Curtains. Yeah. And you know what? They were back discharge printed 30 years ago, and they have not faded a bit. So this was a print, and Georgina was always moving prints on, so it was like, it was boucle fabric that we dyed and then had to stretch it wildly onto the table and then printed it so it all ruched back up. And I was sort of thinking today, no, unfortunately we weren't that clever to make that process. In other words, this is the cheat. So it's the stretchy fabric in the first place. But it was about Georgina moving, so she could reinvent screens every season.
So is that a velour knit? It looks like a big cosmol. It's just
No, but wow. It's got elastic in it.
Oh,
So it's a velvet with elastic.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
said,
So
big
it's
cheek.
just printed elasticated fabric.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So we had to stretch it onto the table like this,
Mm.
and then just dye it, then stretch it on, and but that's got elastic. That's like,
Yeah, yeah.
But it was just a way of them making that design look differently, and then it, and actually that. So yeah, I was looking to wear that to
And what if the elastic broke when because you've used chemicals, you've used...
No, well, elastic is the elastane is generally quite a bit like polyester.
30 years on?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, actually, in fact, if I talk about some early processes, when I moved back here, I started working with an architect, Ruth Morrow, and again, it's having those conversations. So we took the velvet Devore process and put it into concrete. But I had to get the velvet. The backing of the velvet was silk, which is protein, which would break down in the alkali of the cement. So we have to get fabric specially woven with polyester in the back, of which there's 200 metres in the shed, so Stuart next year. And then that was using the discharge process.
Stuart, you cannot be surprised.
Yeah, there's two. So yeah, that's just taking a process and just doing something different. But if I hadn't had the conversations with Ruth, if she doesn't know what that happens, and I didn't know what happened with other things.
Yes.
And then we had to reformulate the cement mix to get it through the void. So,
Wonderful. 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 Thank you.
well, thank you for coming.
Trish, I have 2 questions.